Chapter 1, Shadows over Warsaw. Warsaw, Poland, September, 1939. The city was alive with tension, as if the very air was tightening in the wake of war. Buildings stood as solemn witnesses to the approaching storm, the once proud facades now trembling under the weight of a world collapsing in on itself. From the window of his modest apartment, Witold stood still, staring at the grey clouds that were creeping over the skyline like the fingers of fate. The distant rumble of explosions reverberated through the city, causing the glass to quiver in its frames. It was happening. Everything he feared, everything they had hoped to avoid, was happening. Witold Maria's voice broke through the low hum of dread that had settled in his mind. His wife, always calm in the storm, stood in the doorway, her soft eyes betraying the anxiety she kept hidden beneath the surface. The children there asking questions. What should I tell them? He turned away from the window, the weight of the world settling on his shoulders as he walked towards her. Tell them what they need to hear for now, he said softly, brushing a strand of her dark hair from her face. The truth will come soon enough. Maria searched his face, her eyes lingering a little longer than usual, as if trying to memorize every line, every scar. She knew, just as he did, that this might be the last time they stood together in the safety of their home. The Germans were advancing faster than anyone had predicted, and soon, Warsaw would be under siege. Are you going to fight? She asked, though the question was more of a statement than an inquiry. She already knew the answer. I have to. If we don't, then what was all this for? Our home, our children's future, everything we've built will be ashes. Maria nodded, her lips tight. There was no room for tears here. Not now. Then promise me you'll come back. You always come back. I'll do everything I can, he whispered, pulling her into his arms. But even as he said the words, they felt hollow. Witold had seen the German war machine, their ruthless efficiency, their disregard for life. Poland was already being torn apart, and he was about to be thrown into its gears. Later that night, after putting the children to bed, Witold met with his comrades from the Polish resistance. The air in the small, smoke-filled room was thick with determination and fear. Maps of the city were laid out across the wooden table, dotted with pins marking German checkpoints, supply routes, and places they could hit without immediate retribution. We have to strike now, one of the men said, his voice low but urgent, before they tighten their grip on the city. Witold sat quietly, his fingers tracing the edges of the map. They're too strong, he said finally. Our only chance is to gather intelligence, keep our people informed, and wait for the right moment to resist. And how long will that take? Another man scoffed. The Germans are crushing us. We can't just sit back and watch. Witold looked up, his eyes cold and unyielding. We're not watching. We're planning. If we strike too soon, we lose everything. Patience is our greatest weapon. The room fell silent. Witold's calm authority, honed through years of leadership in the cavalry before the war, was impossible to ignore. They were all itching to fight, but deep down, they knew he was right. This wasn't just a battle for a city. This was a war for survival. As the meeting ended, one of his closest friends, Janusz, pulled him aside. I heard rumors today, he said in a hushed voice, glancing around the room to make sure no one else was listening. The Germans are setting up camps, not just prisons, death camps. They're sending people away, and they're not coming back. Witold's stomach churned. He had heard whispers of such things too, but until now, they had been too distant, too unimaginable. The idea that the Germans would not just occupy but systematically erase people from existence, it was a horror too great to comprehend. How sure are you? Witold asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sure enough, Janusz replied grimly. They're building one near Oswiecim, Auschwitz, I think they're calling it, and if the rumors are true, it's worse than anything we've ever seen. Witold's mind raced. This changed everything. If the camps were real, if people were being sent to their deaths in those places, Poland couldn't afford to wait. They needed to know what was happening behind those walls. That night, as he lay in bed next to Maria, Witold couldn't sleep. His mind was filled with visions of faceless prisoners, huddled in cold barracks, waiting for a fate they didn't understand. He had to do something. They all did. The resistance couldn't just strike at supply lines and hope for the best. They needed real information, something they could send to the Allies, something that would force the world to take notice. And then, the idea took root. He would go into the belly of the beast. Witold Pilecki, the man who had never shied away from danger, would get himself captured and sent to Auschwitz. He would find the truth, and if it cost him his life, so be it. He turned to look at Maria, her face soft in the moonlight. He had promised her he would come back, but now, lying there in the dark, he wondered if that was a promise he could keep. Chapter 2, Into the Fire. Warsaw, September, 1940. The first rays of dawn had barely broken through the heavy clouds when Witold Pilecki found himself standing in a dark alleyway, gripping the worn leather handle of his satchel. His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat louder than the last as he waited. Behind him, the city still slept. What was left of it, the Germans had been in control for over a year, and the suffocating presence of the occupation had become an unbearable normality. But Witold's task was anything but normal. The plan was simple in theory, but in execution, it felt like madness. Get himself caught, allow the Nazis to arrest him, and then, somehow, be sent to Auschwitz, if that place truly existed as the rumors suggested. Witold was no stranger to danger, but this was different. There was no coming back from this if it went wrong. His contact, a fellow resistance member named Kazik, appeared at the far end of the alley. He moved quickly, a figure in the mist. When Kazik reached him, his face was tense, drawn in lines of worry. "Are you sure about this?" Kazik whispered, his voice barely audible above the faint sounds of the city waking up. "I've never been more sure," Witold replied. His breath came out in steady puffs, his nerves buried deep under layers of resolve. "We need to know. We need proof." Kazik shook his head, his eyes flickering between Witold's face and the street behind them. "There are easier ways to die, you know, but none quite so certain as this." Witold allowed a brief smile to tug at the corner of his mouth. "It's not about dying, it's about seeing what others won't. The world has to know." Kazik handed him a small package wrapped in wax paper, documents forged to make Witold appear as a common laborer, a man of no importance, just another face in the crowd of thousands rounded up daily by the Gestapo. These papers would be his ticket to the camp. "Be careful in there," Kazik said, his hand lingering on Witold's shoulder for a moment. "If you get the chance to send word out, we'll be listening." Witold nodded, tucking the papers into his coat. "I'll see you again," he said, though the words felt hollow. Without another word, Witold turned and made his way toward the square where the Nazis were known to conduct their random sweeps. It didn't take long for them to find him. He lingered near the marketplace, standing just on the edge of the crowd, his eyes scanning for the familiar black uniforms of the SS. They appeared as if summoned, a squad of them, their cold eyes sweeping the street. The process was quick and brutal. Shouts in German, a few harsh blows to keep people moving, and then the firm grip of hands on his shoulders. Witold allowed himself to be shoved into line with the others, his heart steadying itself as he prepared for the beginning of his mission. He had no idea what awaited him on the other side. October, 1940, Auschwitz. Witold had always imagined hell would be hot, fiery, filled with the roar of flames and the stench of sulfur. But when the gates of Auschwitz closed behind him with a metallic clang, he discovered a new kind of hell, one that was cold, damp, and silent. It was as if the world inside the barbed wire existed on a different plane, where the sun's light could not reach, and hope had been bled dry from the air. The first thing that struck him was the smell. It wasn't just the stench of unwashed bodies, though that was overwhelming enough. No, it was something more, something sour, putrid, like the earth itself had been poisoned by the atrocities committed here. The guards didn't speak as they pushed the new arrivals toward the processing barracks, their expressions as empty as the prisoners they tormented. Witold walked with his head down, trying to blend into the mass of terrified men around him. It was the only way to survive here. He quickly realized, draw no attention, become invisible. His life, his mission, depended on it. The barracks were worse than he could have imagined. Rows upon rows of wooden bunks stacked 3 high, crammed with men so tightly that there was barely room to lie down. The air was thick with sickness, and the low moans of the dying echoed through the walls like a mournful wind. Witold's stomach turned as he took his place among them, the reality of the situation beginning to sink in. Chapter 3, First Night. Auschwitz, October, 1940. The night brought no reprieve from the horrors of the day. As darkness settled over the camp, the cold crept in like a slow death, gnawing at Witold's bones and numbing his mind. The barracks were a suffocating mass of bodies, men pressed together in the dark, too afraid or too broken to speak. The moaning and coughing of the sick surrounded him, and the sharp crack of a whip echoed in the distance. Someone was being punished. Somewhere, another soul was breaking. Witold lay still on the hard wooden bunk, staring at the cracked beams above him. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to calm his racing thoughts. His body ached from the hours of back-breaking labor the Germans had thrown at him the moment he arrived. They worked the prisoners like machines, relentless in their cruelty. The guards seemed to take pleasure in it, their boots crunching in the dirt as they barked orders, swinging their clubs at the slightest provocation. He couldn't afford to think about what might happen next. The truth was worse than anything he'd prepared for, worse than any nightmare he could have imagined, and yet, he had to stay focused. He wasn't just another prisoner here, he had a mission. His mind drifted to the faces of the men around him. Some were so gaunt they barely looked human anymore. Hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, bodies that looked like they might collapse under the weight of their own suffering. But there was something else in their eyes, something Witold recognized. It was the look of men who still had a sliver of fight left in them. Perhaps not hope, but defiance. And in that defiance, Witold saw the seeds of resistance. In the distance, the faint glow of lights flickered from one of the watchtowers, casting long shadows across the camp. Witold's thoughts began to sharpen. He knew what he needed to do. The rumors about the camp had been true. This place was not just a prison, it was a death factory. People were being sent here to disappear, to die without a trace. If he could document what was happening, if he could get the word out, the world would have to act. He had to find a way to gather information, names, numbers, the full extent of the horrors unfolding behind these fences. Witold had already made contact with two men in his block, both of whom had been part of the resistance before being captured. Marek, a former officer, and Stefan, a railway worker who had smuggled supplies to resistance fighters before he was betrayed. They had recognized him from the Warsaw Underground, though none dared speak openly about their past. Here, words could get you killed. The three of them had exchanged only brief glances, but it was enough to know that they were still in the fight. They would have to be careful, move slowly, build trust with other prisoners, and identify who among them could be counted on. Witold couldn't risk exposure. The Nazis had informants everywhere, desperate men willing to sell out their own for a piece of bread, or a few extra minutes of life. But he was determined. If there was a way out of this, if there was a chance to expose the truth, they would find it. The next morning came with the harsh call of a guard. The barracks shook as boots hit the ground, prisoners scrambling to line up outside in the freezing dawn air. Roll call lasted for hours, a brutal ritual of standing at attention while the SS officers counted and recounted the rows of prisoners. Anyone who wavered or stumbled was beaten, sometimes shot on the spot. Witold stood in line, his face a mask of calm. His body screamed from the cold and the ache of yesterday's labor, but he forced himself to remain still. The guards moved down the rows, inspecting the prisoners like cattle. When one of them passed Witold, their eyes locked for a moment. The guard's lip curled in a sneer, but he kept walking. Witold exhaled slowly. He had to stay invisible. After roll call, they were marched out to the fields. The work was endless, digging, hauling, breaking rocks, tasks designed to exhaust them, to strip away their humanity bit by bit. Witold's hands bled, his muscles ached, but his mind stayed sharp. As he worked, he observed the camp, the guards, the routines, the movements of trucks and trains in and out of the gates. Every detail mattered, every scrap of information could be useful. By midday, the sun was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, and the cold seeped deeper into their bones. Witold glanced at Marek, a few rows away, as he struggled with the weight of a sack of gravel. Marek caught his eye and gave the slightest nod. It was time. During their lunch break, If the watery soup they were given could be called lunch, Witold and Marek sat together under the guise of sharing warmth. They spoke quietly, their heads bowed, as other prisoners huddled around them. "We need to start gathering names," Marek whispered, his breath visible in the cold air. "People who've disappeared, people they've taken to the gas chambers." Witold nodded. "We'll need someone on the inside of the barracks where they process the newcomers, someone who can keep track of the numbers." "There's a man I know," Marek said. "He works in the administration building. If we approach him carefully, he might be willing." "Careful is the only way we survive this," Witold muttered. He looked around, making sure no guards were watching. "We have to be patient." Stefan, who had been listening from a few feet away, leaned in. "There's talk of sabotage. Some of the men in the factories are ready to fight back." "Not yet," Witold said firmly. "If we move too soon, we'll be crushed. We need evidence, proof of what they're doing here. That's how we fight." Stefan frowned, but he didn't argue. They all knew the stakes. One wrong move, and the entire camp could be turned against them. As the bell rang to signal the end of their break, Witold rose to his feet. He glanced back at the barracks, at the watchtowers, and the lines of barbed wire that encircled them like a noose. This was a prison designed to break men, to erase them from existence. But Witold was not here to be erased. He was here to bear witness. As they were marched back to their workstations, he made a vow to himself. "I will survive this. I will live to tell the world what happened here, even if it costs me everything." Chapter 4, Seeds of Resistance. Auschwitz, November, 1940. Witold kept his eyes trained on the ground as the cold wind whipped across the camp, biting through the thin fabric of his prisoner's uniform. The November air carried with it a deeper chill than before, as if the very earth beneath their feet had absorbed the misery of the men trapped here. He had learned to move without drawing attention, to carry his body with the stoop of the beaten, the shuffle of the defeated. It was the only way to survive. But inside, Witold was anything but broken. His mind was a constant hum of observation. He had started memorizing the layout of the camp, the positions of the guard towers, the times of the changing shifts, the number of prisoners transferred each day. He catalogued the men he could trust, those he could approach without fear. The underground resistance was growing, but it was fragile, like a sapling in a storm, and he had to tread carefully. They worked for hours in silence, breaking rocks in the yard. The guards paced along the edge of the group, their rifles slung over their shoulders, eyes cold and watchful. Every few minutes, Witold glanced toward the administration building. If Marek's contact was going to help, they would need to move quickly. At the midday break, Witold made his way to Marek's side, the two of them sitting shoulder to shoulder as they had done every day since arriving. They ate their watery soup in silence, speaking only with their eyes. "How is it going with your man?" Witold asked quietly. Marek didn't look up from his bowl. "He's willing. We've agreed to meet tonight after roll call, by the back of the barracks." Witold nodded, but a knot formed in his stomach. One misstep, and the entire operation could collapse. The camp was full of informants, men so desperate to save their own skins, that they would turn in their comrades for an extra crust of bread, or a lighter work assignment. But there was no other way. If they were to get the information they needed, they had to take risks. That night, after the freezing wind had driven them into their bunks, Witold slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the men sleeping around him. The barracks were dark and silent, except for the occasional cough or moan from the sick and dying. He moved quietly, his heart pounding in his chest, as he made his way to the back of the building where Marek and the contact would be waiting. As he approached the meeting spot, he saw the faint silhouette of two men huddled in the shadows. Marek waved him over, his face barely visible in the dim light of a distant watchtower. "This is Ludwig," Marek whispered, introducing the man standing beside him. Ludwig was thin, with sharp, hollowed-out features and nervous eyes that darted back and forth. He worked in the camp's administration office, sorting through paperwork and records, information that could be invaluable if it fell into the right hands. Witold nodded in greeting, keeping his voice low. "I've heard you're willing to help." Ludwig hesitated, his lips trembling in the cold. "I don't know how much I can do," he said quietly. I can only get glimpses of the lists. There are too many guards around. We don't need everything at once, Witold assured him. Just names, numbers, any record of what's happening to the people they bring here. Ludwig swallowed, his eyes flicking nervously toward the barracks. If they find out. They won't, Witold said firmly. We'll protect you. We'll be careful. For a moment, Ludwig said nothing, the weight of fear pressing down on his thin shoulders, but then, with a nod, he made up his mind. I'll do what I can. Marek clapped him on the shoulder. You're doing the right thing. As they parted ways, Witold felt the tension ease, but only slightly. The first step had been taken, but the road ahead was perilous. One wrong move could lead to death, not just for Ludwig, but for all of them. Witold knew they had to remain cautious, patient. The truth was their weapon, but it had to be wielded with care. Over the next few weeks, Ludwig began smuggling small bits of information to Witold and Marek. It was slow, dangerous work, but each scrap of data was a piece of the puzzle. Names of prisoners who had disappeared, numbers of transports arriving each week. Rumors about the gas chambers were true. Chapter 5, The Final Mission. Auschwitz, January, 1941. Witold Pilecki stood at the edge of the camp, watching as another transport arrived. It was a bitterly cold morning, the kind of cold that gnawed at the bones, but Witold's mind was elsewhere. After months inside the death camp, the information he had gathered had grown into a detailed account of Auschwitz's horrors. His mission was nearing its most dangerous phase. He had to escape. The underground network Witold had built was fragile but functioning. With Ludwig's help, they had identified prisoners willing to fight, smuggled messages out to the Polish resistance, and even sabotaged small operations within the camp. But it wasn't enough. Witold knew that to truly expose the atrocities, someone had to bring the evidence to the outside world, and that someone had to be him. He could feel the weight of that decision settling over him like a shroud. He had survived longer than most in this place, but if he stayed, he would likely die before his mission was complete. He had to make his move now, while the resistance was still intact and while they had the support of a few key insiders. The risk was enormous, but Witold had never been one to shy away from risk. This was the fight of his life. Chapter 5:1, The Escape. The night of the escape was dark, the sky heavy with the threat of snow. Witold and two other prisoners, Jan and Edward, had planned every detail for weeks. They had bribed a guard to turn a blind eye, smuggled civilian clothes into the camp, and mapped out the guards' patrol routes. But even with all the preparation, the chances of success were slim. They slipped from their bunks in the dead of night, moving silently across the frozen ground. The camp seemed to hold its breath as they crept toward the fence. Witold's heart pounded in his chest, every sound magnified in the cold night air. His senses were on high alert, every nerve stretched taut. One wrong move, one noise too loud, and the SS would be on them like wolves. The guard they had bribed was nowhere to be seen, but they couldn't wait. Witold cut through the fence with the small wire cutters they had stolen from the workshop, his hands trembling from both the cold and the tension. Time seemed to slow as the wires snapped one by one. And then, suddenly, they were through. Witold motioned for the others to follow, and the three men slipped into the woods beyond the camp, their hearts racing. The snow had begun to fall, soft and silent, covering their tracks as they ran. They didn't stop until they were miles away, deep in the forest, where they finally allowed themselves to breathe. Witold looked at his companions, the exhaustion and relief etched on their faces. They had done it. They had escaped Auschwitz. But Witold knew their journey was far from over. Chapter 5:2, Delivering the Truth. For weeks, Witold and his companions traveled across the frozen Polish countryside, evading German patrols and surviving on whatever food they could scavenge. Their goal was Warsaw, where Witold could deliver the detailed report he had written about Auschwitz, names, dates, the horrifying truth about the gas chambers and the mass executions. It was a report that could change the course of the war, if only the right people saw it. By the time Witold reached Warsaw, he was gaunt, his body worn down by months of starvation and cold, but his spirit remained unbroken. He made contact with the Polish underground, handing over his report to commanders who were stunned by the scale of what he had witnessed. They immediately began working to smuggle the information to the Allies, hoping the world would finally wake up to the horrors unfolding in the camps. Witold's report was one of the first comprehensive accounts of the Holocaust to reach the outside world. It would eventually make its way to the British government, and though the response was slow, the truth of Auschwitz could no longer be denied. Chapter 5:3 After the War. Witold didn't stop fighting after Auschwitz. When the war ended, he returned to a Poland that had traded one oppressor for another. The Soviet occupation brought its own brand of tyranny, and Witold, ever the patriot, could not stand by while his country fell under Stalin's rule. He joined the anti-communist resistance, once again risking his life to fight for Poland's freedom, but this time, the enemy was closer to home, and the risks even greater. The Soviet-backed Polish government was ruthless in rooting out dissent, and Witold knew it was only a matter of time before they came for him. In 1947, Witold was arrested by the communist authorities. He was subjected to brutal interrogations, beaten, and tortured, but he refused to betray his comrades. Even in the face of unimaginable pain, his resolve never wavered. The trial that followed was a farce. Witold was charged with espionage and treason, crimes he had never committed. The new regime saw him as a threat, a symbol of resistance that needed to be crushed. Despite his undeniable heroism during the war, despite the fact that he had risked his life to expose the atrocities of Auschwitz, Witold Pilecki was sentenced to death. Chapter 5:4 The End. On the 25th of May, 1948, Witold Pilecki was executed by a firing squad in Mokotów prison in Warsaw. His death was a cruel irony. He had survived the unimaginable horrors of Auschwitz only to be murdered by his own countrymen. As he stood before the firing squad, Witold did not beg for mercy. He faced his executioners with the same quiet strength that had carried him through the darkest days of the war. In his final moments, he was at peace with the choices he had made, the sacrifices he had given for a cause greater than himself. His final words, spoken moments before the shots rang out, were a testament to the man he was. I have tried to live my life so that in the hour of my death, I would feel joy, rather than fear. Witold Pilecki died as he had lived, fighting for freedom, for truth, and for the soul of his country. Though the world would not fully recognize his heroism until years later, his legacy as one of the greatest resistance fighters of World War II would endure. Epilogue. Decades after his execution, Witold Pilecki's name was finally cleared. The communist regime that had condemned him was swept away, and the truth of his life, his bravery, and his sacrifice was brought to light. In Poland, he is now remembered as a national hero, a man who chose to enter Auschwitz, the heart of darkness, so that the world could know the truth. Today, his story is taught in schools, his face appears on memorials, and his legacy continues to inspire generations of people who believe, as he did, in the power of truth and the unbreakable human spirit.